The girl who would later be called Ashes was born with another name, one not spoken past her 5th year. It was whispered into the dark hair at her crown by a mother who died choking on blood, and it was buried with her, 6 feet under mesquite and stone. The name belonged to a bloodline older than any border, a line forged by warriors who once rode bareback across Sonoran dust, who painted their faces with coals and fought beside the Apache long before rifles and treaties stained the land. But by the time the girl turned 7, she had learned to hide, not just her name but everything that connected her to the old fire. Her skin, the color of cracked pecan shells, drew questions in the White Run orphanage where she was dropped off by a man with no last name and a gun tucked into the back of his belt. Her cheekbones made the nuns stare too long. Her silence made them cruel. They called her Clara as if that might whitewash her tongue, but inside she never answered to it. Inside she remained ash and ember, unnamed but not extinguished. Years passed, she grew wiry, long-limbed, strange. She took to quiet corners and watched everything. She listened to the way men lied when they were afraid and how women smiled when they wanted to be forgotten. She learned where to stand to avoid the switch, how to stitch a wound, how to gut a chicken and a man in nearly the same way. A priest tried to tame her with hard prayer and harder hands, but she bit him deep enough to leave a scar on his knuckle. After that, no one touched her again. By 14, she vanished. They said she ran into the desert, said coyotes must have eaten her, said girls like that don't last long out there, but they were wrong. She joined a group of women who weren't wives or whores. Drifters, some, widows who never remarried, half-bloods with no place to belong. They moved through mining towns like dust storms, staying just long enough to earn coin and scars. They taught her how to fight like a woman, not with fists but with everything else. How to lace her knife under her breastbone, how to poison a man's whiskey with nightshade leaves, how to vanish between breaths. Still, she did not speak of her blood, not even when an old Apache scout nodded at her across a fire and said, "You look like one of us." She only shrugged. At 17, she rode with cattle thieves. At 20, she stole a sheriff's horse and was never caught. Her face hardened into something that made men forget they once found her pretty. Her hands could fire a pistol without tremor. She drank little and trusted less. No one knew where she came from, not even the women she rode with. They called her Ashes because once, when a man tried to brand her during a drunken game, she held his wrist over a fire until he screamed and she whispered, "Now you're marked." She would have gone on that way, nomadic, hollow, dangerous, had it not been for a wounded boy. He came crawling into the canyon where she was camped, ribs torn open like dry cloth. His hair was matted with blood, and he clutched a ragged feather tied around his wrist. When she saw it, she froze. It wasn't just Apache, it was hers. The symbol knotted into the feather, sharp chevron lines, red thread through a black quill, belonged to a family long thought burned out. It marked kinship, once worn by warriors who rode beneath her grandfather's command before the Americans tore through the Sierra Matters. She had seen it in a dream, on the wrist of her brother who died before he could crawl. She bound the boy's wounds and didn't speak. He came awake the next morning, fevered and rambling. He spoke in broken English, mostly Apache. She caught enough to understand he'd escaped a massacre. Soldiers, or something worse, wearing soldiers' coats. A band of renegades calling themselves the Silver Guard, white men who broke from the cavalry, now hunting natives and half-bloods for sport. They'd come in the night, slit throats, burned mothers alive, took the strong for labor, killed the weak. The boy had been left for dead. She fed him prickly pear and river water until he could stand. When he asked her name, she said only, Ashes. He called her Shiyajai after that, little one. But it wasn't affection, it was a challenge. Because he saw what she had tried to bury. He saw her cheekbones and the scar beneath her lip and the old rage in her eyes. He knew what she was. And he didn't trust her. Not yet. A week passed, then 2. The boy healed slowly, and the desert began to whisper to her again. It came first in dreams, fire and smoke and horses screaming. A woman's voice singing something guttural and wild, something old. Then in signs, a snake shedding its skin beside her bedroll, a hawk circling once and vanishing east. She followed the signs without meaning to, drifted into old country, Apache country. What she found there would end her silence, would drag her bloodline screaming back into the world. Because the Silver Guard was real. And they were hunting her people still. The land east of the Dragoon Mountains was dying slow, the way all places do when too much blood sinks into the dirt. Vultures circled low, trees grew twisted. The wind smelled like metal and rotted milk. Ashes knew bad ground when she rode through it, and this ground hated everything alive. The boy, whose name she'd finally learned was Nanton, walked behind her most days, wouldn't take a horse even when she offered one, said they moved quieter this way, said he didn't trust saddles since the raid. Ashes didn't ask more than once. She noticed how his eyes tracked the horizon like a man twice his age, how he kept a blade in his boot and checked it before they slept. He didn't smile, but when they passed a dry gulch filled with snake grass, he muttered, "We used to play here, before." She didn't ask what before meant, she already knew. The Silver Guard was moving west. That's what the next survivor told her, a woman with burned scars up both arms and no teeth left. Ashes found her near the ruins of an adobe mission, crawling under a tilted cross. She'd cut her own bindings with a piece of obsidian and bled all the way down to her fingers. Nanton recognized her, called her auntie but didn't cry. The woman spoke in gasps, said the guard had taken 20 this time, boys, girls, mothers. Said they wore coats like cavalrymen but carried brands and knives, not flags. Said one of them had a silver medallion carved with a skull and snake hung around his neck like some holy relic. Ashes listened, then buried the woman when she died 3 hours later, wrapped in a blanket that used to be hers. That night she took out a small pouch from beneath her shirt, untied it slow. Inside was a bit of bone and braided hair, a chip of flint, a scrap of red cloth. It wasn't much, but it was everything that proved who she'd been once. She held it in her palm and let herself remember. Her mother's voice in the morning, soft as cotton. The way her father's hand felt on the top of her head when he told her to run. The way the stars looked over their camp the last night they were all alive. Then she poured the contents into the fire. Nanton watched but said nothing. By the next morning, she was no longer hiding. She painted her cheeks with ash and coal, wove her hair in 2 thick braids and tied them with mesquite bark. Nanton brought her a woven sash from the dead woman's pack, and she wrapped it around her waist like armor. She no longer looked like ashes. She looked like something reborn. They moved faster after that, found others in hiding. A blind grandfather in a cave near Agua Prieta, 3 children in a dry well, a teenage girl who hadn't spoken since her mother was shot. Each one added to the weight of Ash's purpose. Each one marked the path of the guard. She started to draw maps in the dirt each night, traced where the attacks had happened, where the prisoners were taken. Nanton said there was a place, an old army fort abandoned years ago, now used by the guard as their camp. Said the men laughed when they talked about it, called it Fort Redemption. She said nothing when she heard that name, but her jaw tightened. She knew Fort Redemption. She'd seen it once when she was young. Her father had taken her there in the last days before they tried to flee south. Back then it had a different name, but the bones were the same. Stone walls, iron gates, a gallows in the courtyard. It was built for holding tribes before they were relocated. Some never left. Now it belonged to killers who hunted her people for sport. Ashes decided she would go there, not to sneak in, not to spy, to burn it to the ground. Nanton thought she was mad. "We can't fight them, they have guns, horses, there are too many." "I don't need to fight them," she said, "I just need to break them." She began to prepare. First she gathered what remained of the survivors, not many, a dozen at most, but each one had a reason to fight. Some wanted revenge, some wanted their family back, some just wanted to die on their own terms. Ashes didn't promise victory, she promised reckoning. She trained them in silence, showed them how to trap horses, how to poison water with datura, how to use the land as shield and blade. She taught them how to vanish in plain sight. Nanton helped, though he still didn't smile. Then came the night they stole into a mining camp and slit the throats of 3 Silver Guard scouts. Ashes left one alive. She carved a message into his chest with the tip of her knife. "You are prey now." Then she let him crawl back to Fort Redemption. It was the beginning. Over the next week their attacks came like ghosts. One by one, the guard began to vanish. A man drowned in a spring where no water flowed. Another was found hanging from a cottonwood with a feather stuffed down his throat. 2 more were burned alive in their tents. Fear began to ripple through their ranks. They started guarding their own food, accusing each other, drinking more. Ashes watched from the cliffs above the fort and waited. But she knew fear wasn't enough. She needed a reason to draw them out, to face her where the land could shift against them. So she sent a message. She found a dying rancher on the edge of the desert, gave him water, gave him fire. In return, she made him a deal. He rode into Fort Redemption 3 days later, his lips cracked and blistered, speaking just enough truth, that he'd seen a group of survivors massing in the canyon, that they had women, children, horses, that they were weak, that they could be taken. The guard bit. On the 12th night since the killings began, they rode out in full force. 24 men with rifles and spurs. Ashes waited for them in the canyon, where the walls were steep and the stars held their breath. She had no army. Only 12 half-starved survivors and the land itself. But that was enough. Because she had something the guard had forgotten existed. She had fury. When the first explosion went off, it lit the canyon like a second sun. Horses screamed, men fell, the dust choked everything. Then came the arrows, then the fire. Ashes moved through it like she belonged there, face blackened, blade in hand, gun low and ready. She did not scream. She did not pray. She hunted. When it was over, half the guard was dead. The others scattered. Nanton caught one trying to climb the canyon wall and brought him down with a stone to the head. Ashes found the man with the silver medallion hiding under a dead horse. She dragged him into the moonlight and looked him in the eyes. "Do you know what this land remembers?" she asked. He spat blood. She didn't wait for an answer. The next morning, she left his body hanging from the same tree where her people once watched their kin die. The medallion lay shattered at his feet. Fort Redemption never recovered. It stood empty weeks later, its gates swinging open in the wind. But Ashes didn't stay to watch it rot. She had other names to find, other flames to feed. They rode north after the rains. The blood had dried behind them, but Ashes knew better than to call anything finished. The silver guard was shattered, yes, but shattered glass still cuts. Scattered men can regroup. Vengeance, once born, doesn't go to sleep. It waits, burrows, festers. Nanton had grown quiet since the canyon fight, not the brooding quiet she'd come to know, but something heavier, like a door closed for good. He'd taken a man's life with his own hands and hadn't spoken since. Ashes left him be. Death leaves a taste that only time can rinse out. They moved through burned-out villages and dry arroyos, past cattle stripped to bone and churches where the bells no longer rang. Signs of conflict followed them like vultures, camps torn apart, tracks leading nowhere, children's dolls half buried in sand. Something worse than war had passed through here, something personal. On the edge of a broken mesa, they met a man called Josiah. He wore a cavalry coat turned inside out and carried a long-barreled Sharps rifle with silver inlays. His eyes were ruined, white as milk, but he heard them coming a mile away. Said he'd fought at Dragoon Springs. Said he'd buried 100 men before breakfast. Said he knew Ashes the moment she dismounted. "Your scent's like burnt sage," he told her, "same as your grandfather." She didn't ask how he knew that. He invited them into his shack, fed them a stew made of something unspoken, and unrolled a leather map across the table. On it were circles, 8 in all, drawn in dark ink. He pointed to the northernmost. "Here," he said, "where the old line ends, that's where they're taking the children." Ashes stared at the mark. It lay past the Salt River, near an abandoned Spanish mission folded into the cliffs. A place spoken of in old tongues, where the walls were built from bones and lime, and nothing grew within a mile of its shadow. "They call it Los Muros," Josiah said. "The walls, but that ain't its real name." "What is it then?" Nanton asked, voice raw from disuse. Josiah smiled with no teeth. "Where fire forgets." Ashes understood. Some places don't need names. They wear their purpose like skin. It wasn't just the Silver Guard anymore. Something deeper moved now. The violence wasn't random, it was ritual, a pattern of taking, of cleansing, of erasing bloodlines. Ashes began to understand the truth she had long avoided. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about extinction. They rode with Josiah for 4 days, his horse following sound and scent like a hound. He showed them old cavalry trails, cut through rock where only the lizards went. They passed charred wagons, bones tied to posts, a hill where 20 rifles were buried muzzle down as warning. But they kept on. On the 5th day, they reached the edge of Los Muros. It was worse than the stories. The mission was half swallowed by the cliff, its bell tower cracked open like a skull. The walls bore sigils, painted in rust, maybe blood, spirals, crosses, animals turned inside out. Smoke drifted from the old sanctuary. No bells rang. They waited until nightfall. Ashes crept close, leaving Josiah and Nanton in the high rocks. She moved barefoot, knife strapped to her spine. The smell hit first, iron and rot, unwashed bodies, piss, incense. Then sound, chanting low in no language she knew. Inside the mission, she saw them. Men in stolen uniforms, Apache boys bound at the wrists. A fire built in the center, around which walked a man in a preacher's coat, barefoot, face daubed with white clay. He carried a whip made of braided hair. He did not speak, only sang. When he turned, Ashes saw it. His medallion. Not silver, not carved. It was bone, human, shaped like a jaw with the teeth still in it. She pulled back into the dark, heart steady. This was no splinter cell of the guard. This was the core. And it wasn't after survival. It was after erasure. She returned to the cliffs. They're preparing something, she told Josiah. Not a camp, a sacrifice. Nanton spoke at last. Then we burn it. But Josiah shook his head. Fire won't kill what's already dead. Ashes met his blind gaze. Then we changed the story. They planned through the night, called up the ghosts of old battles, dug trenches where no man would expect them, cut cactus spines and poisoned the water pots. Josiah left before dawn, saying only, "When you hear the hawk cry, start the killing." Ashes stood with Nanton in the dark before dawn. He looked older now, though his face was still a boy's. His hands were steady on the rifle she'd given him. "You sure you want this?" she asked. He didn't answer, just looked toward the mission. "Then we go," she said. They approached from the west, where the shadows were deepest, took out 2 sentries with arrows to the neck, moved through the outer wall like smoke. They were 10 feet from the inner sanctum when the cry came. Not a hawk. A scream. Josiah. Then gunfire. Everything broke. Ashes didn't hesitate. She kicked open the mission door and threw a lit bundle of tar-soaked rags. Fire took instantly. The preacher turned, mouth opening wide, not in fear but ecstasy. The children began to wail. She shot him through the face. Nanton rushed to cut the bindings. 2 other men came at him with clubs. He shot one. Ashes buried her blade in the other's gut. Blood hit her face hot. She felt nothing. More men flooded in. A melee of fists, knives, screams. The air choked with smoke and dust. Somewhere above, the bell tower groaned and collapsed. Ashes found herself on the ground, throat clutched by a massive man, arm going numb. Then a shot. Then another. The weight lifted. Josiah bleeding from the mouth, rifle in hand. "Leave nothing," he said, then fell. When the sun rose, Los Muros was ash and ruin. The children were safe. Some were too young to speak. Some would never speak again. But they were alive. Ashes stood among the rubble, blood drying on her arms. Nanton came to her, holding the bone medallion. He dropped it in her palm. She turned it over once, then ground it beneath her boot. It didn't feel like victory, not yet. But it felt like a beginning. She looked to the northern horizon, where the land folded into red rock and silence. There would be more. But she no longer ran from her blood. She walked in it now. There was no trail, only memory. Ashes moved north beneath the changing sky, into land where rivers ran shallow and trees twisted upward like hands begging for rain. The salt river behind her. Los Muros blackened and caved in. Nanton rode beside her on a stolen pony, the children gone east with a pair of Yavapai scouts who owed Ashes more than they spoke aloud. It was quiet now, too quiet, the kind of silence that comes not from peace but from waiting. Josiah's death had left a hole, not just in their numbers but in the rhythm of things. He had been a voice that knew the shape of the enemy, a relic with teeth. Without him, there were two ghosts chasing smoke, but Ashes had never depended on another voice to tell her what was real. She still saw the man with the jawbone medallion in her sleep, still felt the weight of his death like unfinished business, not fear, not guilt, but something worse, incompletion. Because behind that man, behind the preacher and his stolen rights, was something older, something she didn't yet understand. Nanton didn't speak of it, but Ashes could feel it in his glances, in the way he kept his rifle closer at night, even when there was no fire, no visible threat. He had started humming to himself in the dark, a lullaby from the old tongue. Ashes didn't stop him. That kind of song kept bones from unraveling. They crossed into territory once Apache, now abandoned. The U.S. Army had pulled back after the last treaty failed, leaving behind empty outposts and burned fields. The people had either fled to Mexico or been swallowed into white towns where they took new names, new faces, ghosts in their own skins. Ashes followed whispers. A merchant in Fort Thomas said a white man with a scar down his spine and a preacher's smile had passed through weeks ago, headed west, trailed by wagons carrying chained bodies and crates labeled salt, grain, spirits. She knew what those crates really carried: shackles, tools, bones carved into charms. They were moving again, what was left of the Silver Guard, rebranded, reorganized, like a snake shedding skin, uglier underneath. At a bend in the Gila River, Ashes found proof: the remains of a camp only a day old, fires still smoldering, a dog shot through the jaw and left twitching. She buried it. Nanton found the bones of a child in a pot half covered by cloth, not burned, not buried. Offered. Ashes clenched her fists until her nails drew blood. She looked west, to where the sky dipped into a dark throat of mountains. That's where they're nesting now, she said. How do you know? Nanton asked. Because nothing grows there, she answered, and because I can feel it. They reached the pass 3 days later. The horses balked. The air turned sour. A wind blew that didn't stir dust or grass, only skin. What stood before them was no fort, no mission, no settlement. It was a pit carved into the earth, surrounded by wooden stakes and leather tents sewn with bone. Smoke rose from the center, thick and blue, perfumed with something sickly sweet. Men moved among the shadows, dressed not in uniform but in symbols, painted faces, animal skulls, silver eyelets pinned to their chests. A cult now, no longer calling themselves soldiers. Now they called themselves the Keepers. Ashes watched from the high rock. There were prisoners. Dozens, maybe more, native, Mexican, black, anyone the Keepers deemed less than blood pure. Some were beaten, some branded. One woman had her mouth sewn shut. It was worse than she imagined. This wasn't about hunting anymore. It was about belief. Ashes turned to Nanton. We can't break this with fire. No, he said, but we can rot it from the inside. They waited until dusk, then came down the far slope, disguised in scraps taken from the dead at Los Muros. Grease on their faces, bone charms around their necks. Ashes knew the old ways of passing unseen. Nanton followed her lead. They entered the camp under the smoke curtain, past drunk sentries, past piles of ash where fingers still poked up like roots. Inside, they found the prisoners shackled to posts, eyes wide and blank. Fear had hollowed them. Ashes moved without a word, her knife cut quick and silent. She freed 7 before a child gasped and drew a guard's attention. Then the scream, then the gunfire. The camp erupted. Ashes fired once, then dropped the pistol. No bullets could carry the message she needed. She drew her knife and ran straight into the firelight. The preacher wasn't dead, not the one from Los Muros. That one was a vessel. This one, this keeper of names, stood waiting at the edge of the pit. Face painted white, eyes black as soot, holding a brand still hot. He called her by a name she hadn't heard since before she was orphaned. TL stroke adjective I cute Z I cute L stroke ICH I cute adjective, he said. Little red goat. Her family's mocking name given by enemies passed down in hate. She charged. Their fight was not clean. It was teeth and fists and fire. He tried to blind her with sand, but she bit off a piece of his ear. He carved a line across her ribs, but she drove her knife into his thigh. The earth seemed to tremble, screams around them, chains breaking. Then a shot, not from her. Nanton on the ridge, his rifle aimed and smoking. The keeper fell. Ashes took his brand and seared his own symbol into his chest, the broken feather. Then she stood over him and sang, not in victory, in mourning, for what was lost, for what had to be remembered. The camp burned behind them, survivors scattered, some stayed to bury the dead. Ashes did not stay. She walked west, deeper into a land that no longer had names. Her bloodline no longer hidden. Her courage not a choice. It was her inheritance. They came for her in the spring, when the river was thick with thaw and the cottonwoods bloomed white like death shrouds. Ashes had not stayed hidden, not after the pit. Word traveled too far, too fast. Whispers crossed borders and deserts, spoken by mule drivers and medicine women, smugglers and scouts. They said a woman walked the frontier burning out the rot. Said she had the eyes of the dead and the voice of old vengeance. Said she wore no tribe's colors but spoke the language of every wound. She had no need to deny it. She'd carved truth into every man who tried to deny hers. By then she lived in the high country, a plateau above the Verde Valley where the sun came late and the nights kept secrets. Her camp was small, just a lean-to, a mule, a stream. She fletched her own arrows now, let her rifle rust. Nanton had gone south to find what was left of his people. He left her with a carved bone flute and a promise, "When I hear your song, I'll come back." She hadn't played it, not yet. But the past always finds its own path. The men came wearing polished boots. Real army this time, not splintered fanatics. United States cavalry, 30 strong, led by a man with silver epaulets and a red sash tight across his gut. They rode hard, as if speed could disguise fear. Ashes heard them coming hours before. Dust always rides louder than hoofbeats. She stood when they arrived. Unarmed, not from peace but principle, let them see the one they hunted. The officer dismounted. His mustache curled like barbed wire. He read from a parchment that bore the president's seal. It listed names of men she'd killed, of camps she'd burned, of children she'd freed. It called her outlaw, insurrectionist, traitor. It never once said Apache. When he finished, she asked him a single question. "Did you ride this far for justice or erasure?" He didn't answer, just signaled to his men. Ashes didn't run. But the land rose up. Arrows from the ridge, fire from the creek bed, the earth cracked beneath cavalry weight. Smoke, war cries, blood. Nanton had returned. And not alone. The ones Ashes had freed, the children grown into warriors, the women who refused to be buried, the old men who still remembered how to aim, they rose out of the canyon like revenants. Ashes fought without mercy. Her blade knew its path. Her hands knew the rhythm of death. One by one they fell, boots in mud, brass casings in dust. The officer lasted longer than most, but only because she let him. She pressed him to the ground with her knee and made him look at the sky. "This land doesn't forget," she said. Then she opened his throat. By dusk the valley was quiet again. Ashes stood at the center of it, wind tugging at her braids, blood on her cheek. The others did not cheer. They buried their dead and burned what needed burning. No victory, just survival. When night came, she sat by the fire, alone. Nanton came beside her, older now, eyes steady. He handed her the bone flute. "Time to call them," he asked. She looked to the stars. So many had died under them. So many still carried stories that needed telling. "No," she said. "Why not?" She tucked the flute into the pouch over her heart. "Because I'm not done walking." He nodded as if he'd known that all along. Ashes rose with the wind behind her. She walked into the darkness without fear, without farewell, without needing to be seen. Her bloodline no longer hidden. Her courage the weapon that outlived them all.